We were seconds into the rehearsal when my cousin Claire's scream cut through the hall like a siren. She planted herself at the top of the aisle and hollered, "Why is he here?" My stomach dropped. Leo, my 6-year-old son who melts with excitement over small things, was beside me beaming, holding the little paper program like it was treasure. I squeezed his hand, trying to keep him calm, but Claire kept pointing and shouting that she never wanted him there. People around us started whispering. Some made sympathetic faces, most nodded like she'd exposed some kind of scandal. I felt my face go hot and wanted to roar back, but I folded my pride for Leo's sake and steered him out of the church without a scene. Outside on the steps, the air felt thinner and louder at the same time. I tried to kneel and make eye contact, to use the words and tone that helped him when the world got sharp, but he still flinched. He sniffed and blinked big wet eyes, then asked, "Why did she say that about you, Daddy?" I wanted to give him a perfect answer that made everything safe again. Instead, I told him the truth in the simplest way I knew. People sometimes say mean things because they're hurting. I promised him we'd make the rest of the weekend good, that we'd go see the fountain he loved afterward, and that I wouldn't leave him again. He calmed a little when I suggested the fountain, and he hugged my leg like it anchored him to something real. I kept replaying Claire's words the whole drive to the hotel, the way she'd aimed the question like a dart. I tried to work through why she'd act like that when she knew about Leo. We detold the family years ago. We'd asked for understanding and small courtesies. Claire had been in those rooms when doctors explained sensory stuff and meltdowns. Her reaction made no sense and stung like betrayal. I called my brother, who's an uncle to Leo and usually level, and left a voicemail because I didn't want to make more noise at the rehearsal. I kept imagining what people thought, that I'd ignored Claire's wishes, that I'd brought a child to disrupt her perfect day. I wrote an email in my head defending myself a dozen ways and then deleted it each time because I didn't want to give her the drama she seemed to crave. At the hotel that night, we tried to reset. I laid out Leo's little routine, a quiet story, his weighted blanket, the night light angled just so. He brightened when he saw his favorite dinosaur tucked under his pillow. We ate pizza from a place nearby and he ate the cheese first, as he always did. I checked my phone constantly for a message from family or a text from Claire apologizing, and found nothing but the rehearsal photos people had posted. Claire at the altar looking composed, and one shot of Leo at the back of the church looking small. Comments under the photos were split, and that torn feeling came back in my chest. I wanted to call out every critic, to name the ignorance I saw, but I kept quiet because the priority was Leo sleeping through the night. When I tucked him in, he whispered, "Will she be nice at the wedding, Daddy?" I lied a little and said, "People can surprise you," because he needed the comfort of the idea. I told him again how proud I was that he'd come and how brave he'd been. He fell asleep to the sound of my voice, and I sat on the edge of the bed watching his chest rise and fall, feeling a mix of fierce protectiveness and a heavy tiredness I couldn't shake. I began to make a list in my head, names of his doctors, dates of therapies, everything I could imagine needing in case this escalated farther, a practical reflex I'd learned from past small crises. I had no idea how fast this was about to escalate and how that list would become central to a fight I never expected to enter. Dinner had settled into that weird quiet where everyone waits for the next dish and for the toasts to stop, and I kept my cool while my heart beat like a small drum. Claire, my cousin, mouthed, "Thank you for not bringing him," as she clinked glasses with the table. The comment hit like a cheap jab, soft enough for most people to ignore but sharp enough for me to feel it through my ribs. I lifted my glass and smiled in a way she couldn't appreciate. "I'm here without my son tonight," I said loud enough for the table to hear, but he still wanted to say something. I felt the eyes shift and held my breath while I cued the recording. Leo's little voice filled the room on my phone like a bright, fragile thing. He gushed about how happy he was for Claire and her new husband in the exact clumsy way only a 6-year-old with his own rhythm of speech could. "I'm so glad for you, Claire. I like your sparkly dress," he said, and people around the table wiped their eyes, some laughing softly at the honest phrasing. It broke through the pomp and made everything suddenly human and small. Claire's face tightened with fury. You could see it move from forced politeness into something colder. She mouthed thanks to the table, but the hostility was palpable, like static buzzing under her skin. After the plates were cleared, people began drifting to the bar and the dance floor. I tried to sink into small talk to let the evening breathe, but my nerves hummed. I kept looking at my phone for no reason that made sense. Less than 10 minutes after I'd played Leo's message, less than 10 minutes after Claire had visibly stiffened, my phone buzzed against my leg. I glanced down and saw a number I didn't recognize. I answered the call and a woman's voice said, "Hello, this is Child Protective Services. We received a report and we need to speak with you about your son." I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. A knock came at our hotel door not long after. I opened it to a woman wearing the standard ID badge and a calm face that seemed practiced for confrontation. She introduced herself as a caseworker and said she had an emergency removal form. Her role, CPS caseworker, was the exact phrase that made my stomach twist. She said someone had reported neglect and that they were required to inspect our home immediately. For a breathless second, I stood there thinking maybe there'd been a mistake, that someone had mixed us up with another family, but her folder thumped against her arm in a way that left no room for confusion. I told her we were at the reception and that my son was asleep back in our room, that we'd come straight from the rehearsal and I could show paperwork about his therapies and medications. Her face softened for half a second, then the professional mask went back on. "We have to follow the report," she said. "We'll need to see his sleeping space, safety measures, and routine. We'll need to photograph anything that's relevant." Hearing the word photograph made my throat tighten. I pictured Leo's little low bed, the feeding supplies, the discreet adaptations we'd installed so he'd be safe. Those were the things that would be taken as proof of neglect by someone who didn't understand the why behind them. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. I called Mark, my lawyer, right from the hallway while the caseworker waited politely and scribbled notes. I tried to be calm on the phone, but my words tripped over themselves. "They want to inspect our room now," I said. "They've got a form for emergency removal." Mark told me to breathe, to document everything, to not let them take Leo without cause. He told me to get every medical record I could, and to call Dr. Alvarez and Tara to let them know we might need immediate statements about our care routine. I left the call and turned back to the caseworker, who explained the process and the timelines in that neutral, procedural tone that removes the person from the question and leaves only the bureaucratic gears grinding. I felt suddenly exposed in a way I hadn't expected. Playing Leo's message had been my quiet triumph for the night, a way to show the room who he was without making a scene. Now that same moment felt like a trigger someone had watched and used, and the room around me seemed suddenly thinner, like a sheet pulled back to reveal a raw wound. The caseworker asked if I would accompany her to our room, and I said yes, because I had no choice but to cooperate while I tried to keep my kid close. I had no idea then how fast the next days would move, how every email, every medical note, every witness would become armor we desperately needed. She walked through our room like she was cataloging a crime scene, eyes going from thing to thing with that slow, official look that makes everything feel wrong. I tried to answer as she pointed, "Why a low mattress? And what's with the plastic on the couch?" I said. "He sleeps low because raised beds trigger him. The plastic is for incontinence protection." I said it plain and steady, like a script I'd said before to worried teachers and new babysitters, but each answer felt swallowed by her clipboard. She photographed Leo's low mattress and wrote notes that made the mattress sound abnormal instead of necessary. She circled the locks on the kitchen cabinets and took close-ups of the labels on the medication bottles. She filmed the bins of sensory toys and the visual schedule stuck on the wall next to his coat hook. When I told her these were recommended by his doctors and therapists, she muttered, "That's what they all say," and made a call like she was confirming something she already believed. Hearing that tone made my chest tighten, but I kept my voice calm because I needed to be credible to whoever else might read this later. A man on the line asked questions, and then the caseworker looked up at me with the kind of face that doesn't belong at your doorway. "We're placing him with a foster family while we investigate," she said, as if it were a small administrative step. My stomach dropped so hard I felt hollowed out. My first thought was, who will understand him? My second thought was, what could have possibly triggered this? My hands went cold and my ears buzzed with the noise of the hotel party far away, like it belonged to a different life. I called my people fast. I called pediatric developmental specialist Dr. Alvarez first because she's been with Leo since the diagnosis and knows exactly why our home looks the way it does. I told her what the caseworker had said and she answered without hesitation, "I'll come down with documentation and a statement." Her calm steadied me a fraction. I called Jen, my neighbor and a special education aide, and she said she'd come straight to help with testimony about how we manage Leo's care day-to-day and how the adaptations are standard practice. I called lawyer Mark Rivera and he told me to preserve everything, to photograph what I could, and to request immediate supervised visitation. Mark's voice was blunt and fast. "We need to file against an emergency removal and get them to explain grounds. Don't sign anything without me." I remember the frantic checklist forming in my head like a survival list. Get medical records. Call Tara, Leo's special education teacher, for her IEP notes and examples of accommodations at school. Scan therapy notes and behavior plans. Collect witness statements from neighbors, teachers, and his pediatrician. I started snapping my own pictures of the things the caseworker had photographed, making sure timestamps would show everything existed before tonight, making sure there was nothing left to chance. Every single piece mattered because the allegation didn't care if it was wrong, it cared if it could be made to look right. While I worked the phone, the caseworker explained logistics in that dry voice, how long the placement could last, the 72-hour clock for an emergency hearing, and the possibility of a court order. Each phrase pushed me further toward panic, but I kept thinking about Leo's face when he'd woken up in the foster home. I pictured his confusion and knew I had to turn my fear into action. I told the caseworker I wanted a list of everything she'd need, and I asked for copies of any forms she had. She paused before handing me a copy of the emergency removal paperwork. I signed to acknowledge receipt, my hand shaking, knowing that signature didn't mean consent but that the world would record the moment. Mark arrived within an hour, already brisk and prepared. He told me to breathe and to gather everyone willing to write statements. They can't twist documented medical necessity into neglect if we show the records and witnesses, he said. I believed him because he'd handled disability cases before, but belief doesn't stop the ache of a child taken from your arms. I called my mom and told her where Leo was and asked if she could meet us and be with me. She said she was coming. I called more friends and family who understood and who could testify to our routine and to Leo's needs. They agreed to meet and to vouch that everything in our house had been recommended for his safety and support. The hours that followed were a blur of calls, scans, and sobs swallowed into my shirt. I kept picturing Leo learning the new people's timing, their lights, their smells, and I felt like I was losing ground minute by minute. But I also felt something else, lines forming, doctors, teachers, lawyers, neighbors, all showing up in my head as a kind of shield. I didn't know then how long it would take to pull it all together, but I knew one thing clearly. I was not going to let this stand without a fight. The next 48 hours blurred into one long, raw push to stack paper and calls between fits of sleep I couldn't let myself take. I pulled every file I could find, medical records, therapy notes, IEP documents from Tara, medication logs, sensory assessments, anything that proved I wasn't neglectful but careful and informed. I spread them on the kitchen table like armor, sorting by date, scanning pages with my phone, and emailing them to Mark. My hands shook more than I expected, but I kept going because the alternative was imagining Leo alone and afraid without the things that ground him. Dr. Alvarez wrote an immediate letter with medical language I don't pretend to fully understand, but that carried weight. A clear, professional statement that the low mattress, the furniture covers, the locks, and the visual schedules were safety and therapeutic measures recommended for Leo. She offered to testify in court if needed and said, "You did the right thing by setting up his environment." Hearing that calmed something in me I hadn't noticed frayed. I printed her letter 3 times and made sure Mark had scanned versions to file with the emergency hearing motion. Jen, neighbor and special education aide, Jen's character letter came next, precise and warm. She described how I worked daily with Leo, how we used visual routines, how the weighted blanket helped him sleep, and how our home adaptations were part of his safety plan. She wrote about standing in my living room and seeing the same practices they used at school to help students feel secure. Her words were human proof, not medical but lived experience, and they felt like a bridge to the judge's understanding. Lawyer Mark filed for supervised visitation within the 72-hour window, moving faster than I could follow sometimes. He told me over the phone, "We get you in front of the judge with the documentation and witnesses, and we make them show cause." His tone was steady and plain, which I needed. He asked for everything: timestamps on photos, prior emails where I'd explained accommodations to family, receipts for therapeutic equipment, and notes from Tara, Leo's special education teacher. I called Tara and she read a statement down the phone like she was listing facts about a student: individualized supports, classroom accommodations, progress notes. She typed them up and emailed them to Mark within an hour. Between calls, I kept picturing Leo in someone else's house without his weighted blanket, without his visual board that lays out his day, without his little blue octopus toy squish that he squeezes when he's overwhelmed. The image of him reaching for things that weren't there tightened my chest into a fist. I imagined him waking up, blinking at unknown lights, confused by a schedule that didn't match his own. The fear of losing him longer than a night burned underneath every new task I checked off. People started showing up in small practical ways that kept me from fraying entirely. My mom took care of communicating with aunts and cousins who were confused. She called people and said, "We're gathering records, sit tight." My neighbor brought over folders and a stapler. A family friend offered video testimonials about how they'd seen me manage meltdowns and teach Leo calming strategies. Each small human thing added a thread back to normalcy and reminded me this was not just paperwork, it was life. Mark coached me on the language that would matter in court. Medical necessity, individualized care, reasonable accommodations, phrases that translate parenting into legal logic. He told me to prepare to describe daily routines, to explain triggers and calming strategies, and to make simple charts showing how accommodations reduced risk. I made those charts in a notebook while my phone buzzed with messages from Dr. Alvarez confirming she'd drive down if needed, and from Jen saying she could come to testify at the hearing. The list I'd started the night of the rehearsal grew into a packet that felt heavy with everything we'd lived through since Leo's diagnosis. I didn't sleep much, but when I did it was with one eye open in my head, rehearsing what I would say in court, picturing Leo's face when I saw him next, and steeling myself for the moment someone would try to turn loving care into neglect in front of a judge. Every document felt like a lifeline, but none of it replaced the ache of him being somewhere else. Still, with each page I scanned and each witness who agreed to speak, I felt a little less hollow and a little more ready to fight for him. The CPS office felt like an exam room, bright and thin, and when Leo and I walked in, he clung to my leg like I was the only solid thing in the world. He was exhausted and confused, hair sticking up from the ride, eyes tracking everything like a bird trying to find its branch. I kept my voice low and steady because that's how I get him back from the edge. "It's okay, buddy, Daddy S here, we're just going to sit." He let me guide him to the chair and pressed his face into my shoulder, the way he does when the world gets loud. For the full hour, the room felt like glass. The CPS caseworker sat with a clipboard, watching as if every move could be read into a file. They watched closely when I used deep pressure hugs to calm him, when I rocked his chair and counted slowly, and when I pulled out a picture card so he could point instead of trying to find the words. I said simple things aloud so they could hear how I explained transitions. When the timer ends, we pick the blue card and then snack. I kept the language plain because I didn't want technicalities to get in the way of understanding the basics of what keeps him steady. At times he relaxed, his fingers finding the familiar seam of my jacket, and he hummed that little tune he does when he's trying to settle himself. I handed him Squish, his blue octopus, and he clutched it like a talisman. A woman in the corner asked, "How often do you use the weighted blanket?" I answered without hesitation, "Every night. It helps him fall asleep and stay calm." I explained the visuals on the wall and the routines we practiced for transitions. I showed them the picture card system and the way we use timers so he knows what's coming. When the hour ended and they counted down the last 5 minutes on a phone, something in him snapped. He realized he was leaving with me, and then all at once he started to scream, a raw, deep sound that left the bones trembling. It wasn't just noise. It was a full-body spill, arms and legs flailing, tears pouring like rain. I wrapped my arms around him and tried to pull him into the pressure that usually helps, but this one climbed higher than usual. People in the room went quiet in that way that makes you aware of the watching even more. They told me the supervised visit time was over and explained gently that he needed to go back to the foster placement while the investigation continued. I felt like I'd been cut out of the scene. He clung to me and screamed my name, "Daddy, Daddy," over and over until they eased him away. I let go because the staff asked me to, and his tiny body was carried down a hallway that suddenly felt endless. I sat in my car afterward and let the tears come, not trying to be brave for anyone. I let the sobs be clumsy and loud because I had to empty them out of my chest. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a lamp, the folder of medical notes and the laptop open, and Mark called to walk me through the timing. Lawyer Mark said, "Emergency removals have to have a hearing within 72 hours. We move fast. We get the facts and the witnesses in front of the judge." He sounded calm in a way that steadied me. We made a list. Dr. Alvarez would confirm the medical necessity of our adaptations. Tara, Leo's special education teacher, would walk through his IEP and daily supports. Jen would speak about what she'd seen in our home every day. The school principal would verify accommodations and progress. We compiled witness statements into a single packet and prepared a timeline that, when you laid it out, looked like a compass pointing at the reception and at Claire's reaction. Mark wanted to show motive and timing, how her outburst at rehearsal, my playing of Leo's message at the reception, and then the report that arrived less than 10 minutes later all fit together. "If we can show a pattern," Mark said, "then the court sees why this isn't just a random call. We need to question who benefits from this escalation." I printed every email, every text, and the photos with timestamps. My hands shook as I labeled everything, but each label felt like a small anchor. I rehearsed my words for the judge in the quiet hours, simple sentences about routines, sensory triggers, and safety measures. I practiced describing the adaptations without sounding defensive, just factual. He sleeps on a low mattress because raised beds are dangerous for him. The plastic on the couch is for incontinence protection recommended by his therapist. I mapped out how to explain transitions, how to show that I had always sought professional guidance. Around midnight, I called my mom and heard her breathing steady on the line. "You're doing everything right," she said, and it was the kind of belief I needed to hold on to. By morning, the packet was ready and people had confirmed they would come. I felt both exhausted and oddly sharp, like a man who's been stripped down to what he must do. I thought about Leo in that other house and how he'd wake, how he'd look for me, and I promised myself I would make the next steps count. We had to turn the white paper and the stories and the evidence into proof that what I did for my son was love and care, not neglect. Court felt colder than I expected, like the air sucked all the noise out and left only questions. I sat with lawyer Mark Rivera, and watched him move through the room with that calm I needed. He started by laying out the timeline while the judge listened without interruption. Mark's voice was steady. "We will show that every adaptation in this home was recommended, documented, and intended to keep Leo safe. We will show motive behind a rushed report filed minutes after a public confrontation." The simplicity of his opening made the case feel manageable, and I realized then that clarity could cut through the noise. Dr. Alvarez went first for us, and she spoke plainly about Leo's needs. She described why a low mattress is safer for him, why weighted covers help with sleep and regulation, and why visual schedules reduce meltdowns. She answered the judge's questions directly, and when the judge asked if these were standard measures for a child with Leo's profile, she said, "Yes, they are appropriate and medically necessary." Hearing that from someone with her authority felt like someone handing me a key to unlock the door I'd been knocked outside of. Next, the school principal and special education teacher, Tara, testified about Leo's progress at school and the accommodations in his IEP. They spoke about how routines and visuals helped him transition between activities and how he'd made real gains with consistent supports. Tara gave specific examples, a week where he went from 3 meltdowns to 1 after a change in visual supports, and the principal confirmed that this was documented in school records. Their words connected the home practices to school success and showed a pattern of professional oversight, not neglect. Jen, neighbor and special education aide, Jen came in after and talked like someone who'd watched us daily. She described how I taught Leo calming techniques, how we practiced the picture card system, and how the equipment in our home matched what therapists used in their classrooms. She said plainly, this family did what professionals told them to do. That kind of lived witness felt different from medical testimony. It was neighbor truth, the sort that matters because it's not rehearsed. When Claire testified, it was a different tone. She painted Leo as uncontrollable and said she'd feared for his safety at the rehearsal. She looked the part of a bride, scorned, eyes sharp, voice tight. She said things like, "He disrupted the rehearsal and I didn't want him there." Mark didn't rush her or shout. He asked one pointed question after another that placed events in order. He had the reception timeline laid out and pushed gently. "You objected at rehearsal, and minutes after my client played a recording of his son, someone called CPS. Did you make that call?" Claire's face went pale and she fumbled, then said, "I don't recall making a call." The tension rose when Mark introduced the anonymous video. He explained how it had been handed to us, a clip from the reception timestamped. The screen showed Claire at a table, mouth tight, pointing her phone in the direction of the room, then looking down at it as if dialing. The footage matched the CPS report timestamp down to the forensic second. The prosecutor put her hands up like she'd not seen that angle, and the room went quiet enough to hear a pen drop. I felt something unclench in my chest, like a knot finally loosening. After a tense recess while court staff checked the video's metadata, the judge returned. He said the emergency removal required demonstrable, immediate danger to be upheld. With our witnesses and the timestamp video showing clear motive and close timing, he ruled there wasn't sufficient basis to continue the emergency removal. He dismissed the emergency order and ordered a follow-up home visit by a developmental disabilities specialist to independently assess our home. In the interim, he allowed Leo to stay with his grandmother temporarily and ordered unlimited supervised visitation for me. The judge's words felt like a reprieve, a lifted weight, but not the full clearing I'd hoped for. When I left the courtroom, my legs wobbled. People hugged me and Dr. Alvarez squeezed my shoulder like she'd been ready for this and relieved it was over for now. Mark was careful with his optimism and reminded me we still had the specialist visit and a chance for a more permanent resolution. Claire sat off to the side, face stony, and the family looked split in ways that hurt even as I felt vindicated. Walking out, I felt a mix of relief and rawness. The judge had given us back a piece of our life, but the process had already taken hours of breathing and left scars on small things: time with my son, his nights away, the flash of strangers deciding our care. It didn't feel like victory yet. It felt like a step back to where we could start to heal. I kept thinking of Leo's small hands in mine and how soon I'd see them again, and that thought carried me out of the courthouse with a hollow but steady hope. Felt like we were under siege but also oddly prepared. When the second anonymous report landed accusing us of unnecessary medication, I didn't let it unmoor me. The calls from relatives repeating Claire's story stung like echoes of the rehearsal, but each call pushed me to add another paper, another witness, another timestamp to our file. I learned fast that the noise couldn't be allowed to drown the facts. I answered calmly on the phone, asked people to hold off until the court process ran its course, and kept a record of every caller and every claim because documentation had become our shield. The home visit by developmental specialist, Dr. Ramirez, came with a weight I couldn't shrug off. I remember opening the front door and trying to breathe steady while she introduced herself and asked to meet Leo in a quiet voice. She didn't rush in or treat us like suspects. Instead, she sat on the couch and let Leo come to her in his own time, offering a small wave and a gentle smile. She watched how he moved through his room, how his visual schedule sat on the wall, how the weighted blanket folded at the foot of his bed. She asked me to explain the routines without judgment and took notes in a way that felt thorough and fair. Dr. Ramirez watched me use the picture cards and the timer and saw how Leo responded when I gave him the deep pressure he needs to calm. She observed the placement of safety items, the low mattress and the soft edges on furniture, and asked about the plastic coverings because they wanted to be sure these were protective choices, not neglectful ones. I explained clearly that incontinence protection is a medical reality for some children and that our choices were practical and recommended by therapists. She nodded, asked a few clinical questions, and then shifted to write on her tablet with a focus that felt serious and kind. Her assessment was short and sharp in a way that finally cut through the fog. Our home was therapeutic, our routines were appropriate, and our care for Leo was consistent with best practices. She used words the court would like: medically necessary, individualized plan, and reduced risk of injury, and she offered to submit a formal report stating exactly that. Hearing her read back what she'd seen made my chest loosen for the first time since that knock at the hotel. It didn't erase the nights apart, but it put a professional stamp on what we'd lived every day. While the specialist report gave me some breathing room, other family tensions didn't ease. Some relatives kept calling, fueled by Claire's version and by gossip that spread faster than truth. I kept answering and logging. I refused to argue. Instead, I asked for time and said the court was handling it. That approach cut the drama down to facts and prevented more wild emails and false accusations from drowning us. Then an email showed up that made my hands go cold. It contained the reception video clip, the one that had turned the hearing. The sender said he was husband Nate, Claire's husband, and he wrote a short note. He'd tried to stop her and had recorded the moment because he feared what she might do. The clip was the same we'd shown in court. Claire pointing her phone, then looking down, then flinching as if she'd made a call. Nate's note said he'd been there, he regretted not stopping it, and he would corroborate our timeline if asked. But he begged that Claire not know he'd helped. Reading that made my stomach drop and then fill with a fierce relief. This was the kind of corroboration Mark had said could expose malicious intent. I forwarded the email and the video to Mark immediately, explaining Nate's message and the fear that he wanted to stay anonymous. Mark told me to preserve the original headers and metadata and to make no contact with Nate directly. He said we'd need Nate's written statement if he could be convinced to provide one under protections. Mark sounded careful and sharp. This shows pattern and possible motive. We'll file it with the court and ask for a subpoena if Nate will not come forward voluntarily. He said it could be the thread that tied the motives to the act. I felt a tremor of hope, but I also felt the thinness of trust inside my family. Someone had to step forward and name what happened. If Nate would corroborate, it would change how the judge and the rest of the family saw Claire's calls. It could flip the narrative from protective cousin to adversary. For the first time since the reception, I imagined a path not just to closing this case, but to restoring some sense of truth in the family. Mark advised patience and process. He told me we'd let Dr. Ramirez's official report land and then add Nate's evidence to the record. He warned that Claire might push back with more reports and reminded me to keep logging everything. I sat down and wrote a short note to myself, a promise that I would keep acting with clarity and that I wouldn't let fear make me hasty. The days ahead would still be brutal, but with a developmental specialist backing our care and a potential insider corroborating the timing of Claire's actions, we had reason to keep fighting. I felt tired, braced, and oddly steady, like a man holding a flashlight in a long dark tunnel and finally seeing a sliver of daylight up ahead. Claire pushed into my doorway like she owned the place, chest heaving, eyes wild, and she shoved accusations at me without pausing to breathe. She called me selfish, said I'd made her life miserable, and that I'd ruined her wedding, words thrown like knives. I answered as calmly as I could because I didn't want to give her an opening, and I said, "You've already made things worse by calling CPS." She snapped back about her husband leaving and tried to rattle me with drama that sounded hollow in my own hallway. Her bravado fell apart into something smaller and meaner, and I kept my voice steady because Leo was inside. Son Leo came forward from the next room in his dinosaur pajamas, hair still damp from his bath, and for a moment he looked unsure like he always does when people raise their voices. He blinked at Claire, then squared his little shoulders in a quiet way I hadn't seen before and said, "You were mean to my daddy." It surprised me how blunt and clear he was, how the simplicity of his words landed harder than any argument. Claire's face went all at once red and vacant like someone who hadn't expected to be called out by a kid. Her mouth opened, closed, and then she left like a storm that suddenly passed. I held Leo close and felt him press into me, and I realized in that moment he had found a tiny strand of steel in himself. A few days later, my mother called a family meeting and asked them to come over with an open mind. We sat around her table with printouts of Dr. Ramirez's report, the reception video, and stacks of medical notes and IEP pages. People who had defended Claire at first came with their arms folded and their faces closed, but the evidence on the table made it harder to stand behind the story they'd been fed. One of Claire's bridesmaids, who had watched more of the rehearsal than most, told the room she'd seen Claire overreact and that it had felt personal, not protective. Her words made a crack in the narrative that had scared everyone. Then husband Nate stood up. He looked pale and small as he said, "I sent the video, I tried to stop her." He admitted he'd recorded the reception because he'd feared how Claire might act, and he said he regretted not stopping her faster. Hearing Nate confirm what the footage showed felt like a small avalanche. People shifted in their chairs, looking at Claire with new questions in their faces. Nate asked that his help stay discreet because he feared Claire's reaction, but he agreed to give a written statement backing up the timeline and what the video showed. That willingness to stand up quietly changed the room. Once the facts were out, the family changed. The ones who had repeated Claire's lines started to apologize, or at least stop repeating them. Claire and her immediate family signed formal agreements drafted by Mark that told them to cease making reports and to stop contacting us about Leo. They agreed to stay away from bringing this up at family gatherings and to let the legal process do its job. The legal pressure combined with the family's refusal to support her sealed the deal in a real way. CPS closed their investigation and Leo came home for good. When he stepped back into our house the first time, he ran to his low bed and to squish, clutching things like a kid reclaiming his world, and I felt a weight in my chest ease. The aftermath was slow but real. People who used to skip family dinners began bringing invitations with clear notes. All kids welcome, and some relatives asked questions about autism in ways that were shy but sincere. I found myself explaining things at the table about routines and triggers, and I watched faces soften when they understood a little more. A cousin who'd kept his distance began asking to come over so Leo could play in the yard with his son. It wasn't perfect reconciliation, but the house filled with small, steady efforts to include him and to learn. Legally, we kept the protections in place. Mark told me to keep the signed agreements and to keep updated records, and he filed the cease and desist letters that made it clear more reports without basis would bring harassment suits. The paperwork felt ugly and necessary, like building a fence around something precious. I breathed easier knowing we had allies, doctors, a specialist report, written statements, and a lawyer ready to move if needed. Those things didn't undo the nights apart, but they stopped the pattern from repeating. The worst part was the fear that lived under my skin for weeks, the idea that a single angry person could take my son away. That fear eased as days became normal again. Bedtime routines returned, Squish was never far from his hand, and I could leave the house without counting the minutes in my head. For the first time since the reception, I felt safe walking out the door with him, knowing we had people who understood, a stack of evidence to protect us, and legal recourse if anything like that ever cropped up again. The experience left scars, sure, but it also taught the family to see Leo as he is. A little boy who needs certain things to be okay, and a son whose place in our family is worth defending. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.